It's a theological world, after all, after all.
Hello and welcome to It's a Theological World After All. Today we're going to be discussing, is this the end of theology? A raw conversation with contemporary theologian Roger Olson. And in this episode, we want to talk about some of his sobering reflections in his article that he wrote several years ago, in 2020, I believe, called Does Theology Matter Anymore? You can check it out on Patheos blog. Just look it up in Google and you can check it out. This article has actually had quite an impact on me as I've been thinking about some of these issues for some time, but in particular the last year and a half, as this has motivated my Christianity Today article, It's a Theological World After All, and it has motivated this podcast, which we are bringing to you now. So we're starting it off, and we're going to have a raw conversation with Roger Olson. Let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Olson. He is a professor of theology at Truett Theological Seminary of Baylor University in Waco, Texas. He is the author of The Story of Christian Theology, 20 Centuries of Tradition and Reform, The Mosaic of Christian Belief, 20 Centuries of Unity and Diversity with IVP, The Westminster Handbook to Evangelical Theology. He is also a co-author with Stanley Grenz in a newly revised, what is now a newly revised book called The Journey of Modern Theology, From Reconstruction to Deconstruction. So if you're familiar with evangelical theology broadly, Roger Olson is a household name. He's an important figure in contemporary theological discussions. So what we're going to be talking about today is really kind of this bigger question about, is theology dead? Have we traded truth for trends, doctrine for self-help, mystery for marketing? In our very first episode of It's a Theological World After All, we're asking a dangerous question with one of America's most honest theologians, Roger Olson. What happened to theology? And what happens to the world when we lose it? That's what we're going to be talking about today. So, Dr. Olson, I appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us, and thanks for having this conversation today.
You're welcome. Good to be with you.
In your article, Does Theology Matter Anymore? I think that's the exact title. Is that right? I think that
sounds right.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yes, Does Theology Even Matter Anymore? That's the precise title. You start off talking about your friend Stanley Grenz and his kind of haunting warning that we may have entered in a kind of post-theological phase. What did Grenz mean when he said that? And what do you think he meant about that?
So my reflections about him and what he might have meant about that come from conversations that I had with him. First of all, let me just say we're very close friends. His death was devastating to me. 20 years later, I still miss him. And we collaborated on 2 books, co-authored them, and many other things. So we were very close. And he shared thoughts with me that I'm not sure he wanted himself to share publicly. But I don't think he would mind my sharing that toward the end of his life, he did tell me that he thought we were entering a post-theological era in America. But I think he would also say in much of English-speaking world, Australia and Great Britain, Canada, in a lot of places, but especially America, because that's where most of our books are published and our work is done. So he believed that it was becoming more and more difficult, gradually, for theologians to be taken seriously, and especially what they do to be taken seriously, what we do to be taken seriously by pastors let alone people in the pews. But of course, the people in the pews will only take it seriously if pastors take it seriously. So there was a time in my life and in his when very, very few churches would take on a pastor, a senior pastor, who had no theological training at all of any kind. But that has become more and more common. And I could cite examples of churches that I know that have intentionally hired pastors who have no theological training at all whatsoever. And that's just one example of a constellation of experiences that he and I both had, and that I've had since he died 20 years ago, increasingly, that point toward a lack of interest in theology in the churches, in the pulpits, even in Christian colleges, and even in some seminaries. And I could give just so many examples of that. And I have my own thoughts that may not be consistent with Stanley Grenz's about that. But I pinned the beginning of this turn to 1966, when Time magazine published a cover article that said, "Is God Dead?" It was a black cover article with red capital letters just asking, "Is God dead?" And I noticed that after that cover article about theologians who were saying that God is dead, Thomas Altizer, William Hamilton, and some others, after that death of God movement didn't really persist. It didn't take off very well. There have always been some theologians who claim to be atheists. But interestingly, from that day on, Time magazine never again had a theologian on the cover, and they did before that. Karl Barth was on the cover of Time magazine, Paul Tillich was on the cover of Time magazine, Reinhold Niebuhr was on the cover of Time magazine. But after that cover story, Time magazine pretty much dropped theology. Now, there were a few little articles about Carl Henry, Wolfhart Pannenberg, and a few other theologians, but not in recent years that I know of. So to me, that was a turning point. And I once asked the publisher of Time about it. I was on an elevator with him, and I dared to ask him if he knew about that. And he said, no, he'd never noticed that, but he would look into it. And I said, well, it makes me wonder, did the public turn against theology when theologians began to say God is dead? And I think that is true. I think that a lot of people just turned away from theology when theologians, respected theologians, teaching in church-related universities and seminaries, published books saying God is dead. They called it Christian atheism. And I can understand that. But I think it's sad because the result has been that in many churches, even evangelical churches, the focus really is not at all on belief. It's on feelings.
Yeah.
I'll just leave it there. It's on feelings.
Yeah, good. That's helpful. Yeah, it's on feelings and sentiment, and I just related to that. I've in recent years, it certainly has become, and maybe we can unpack this or think about this a bit more as we move along. But it certainly seems quite apparent to me as I look at the American situation, particularly with the closings of so many private Christian colleges recently, certainly trimming down, significant trimming down, and I don't think there's an understatement there, but also closings of some respected, well-known Christian schools and seminaries. I mean, even one of the kind of the place that was considered the bastion of kind of conservative evangelical schools is closing shop and moving to Canada. As you probably know, this is a recent development, which was at one level was shocking. I mean, because of what that seminary was and what it meant to evangelicals, but also many would say that it was predictable in many ways. So maybe we can come back to that and comment on that. But I was curious in your article, you this is something obviously that's close to your heart? I mean, when you read your article, you can tell you're kind of disappointed, obviously, with the situation, emotionally invested in this situation. And at first, when you describe your conversation with Grins, at first you found it to be dubious or something. You didn't quite believe him. But then eventually you suggest that you come around, and now you're sympathetic to what his diagnosis on the situation. Is that right? Is that correct?
I didn't want to believe that he was right, but I already suspected he might be right. But it took some time for me to come around to really believing that what he said was true, or that it had come true, because what he said was that we're entering a post-theological era in America. And it took a while for me to really think of that as true and real already. We're not just entering into it, we're there.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. I think that's right. So, well, let's talk about that a little further, about the vanishing of theology in church and culture. Let me ask you a question again. You offer a definition of theology, and so this will help us understand where you're coming from and obviously your diagnosis of the situation. You describe it as a pursuit of truth about God or something of the sort, and yet you ask, who listens to theologians anymore?
Yeah, that's an existential question. That comes from my own personal experience.
Yes.
Let me tell you a story about that.
Okay.
When I was teaching on campus at Truett Theological Seminary in Waco, Texas, on the campus of Baylor University, my wife and I were members of a pretty large Baptist church that I'd call moderate. Not Southern Baptist, but, ex-Southern Baptist. And they were entering into a discernment period about whether to allow full membership or to grant full membership to people who had not been baptized as believers, but only as infants. Because the church had attracted a lot of people. We had a woman pastor, she was the only woman pastor of a Baptist church in Texas at that time, and a lot of people were coming to check that out and see how that worked. And so it was a growing church, and it attracted some people who only had infant baptism, Methodists, Lutherans, and others. And they formed the idea of a discernment team from within the congregation to talk about it and to make a recommendation. Well, I quickly volunteered to be on that discernment team, pointing out that I was the only theologian in the church and a professional theologian. And they turned me down twice, because one of the members of the team in midstream left the team, and I again volunteered to be on the team, and the nominating committee and the pastoral staff said no. And so, I inquired why, and they said, well, we didn't want any of the big dogs in the church to be on the team. We just wanted it to be the ordinary people. And I began to wonder, if you have a theologian in the church and you're going to make a decision that is clearly theological, why not at least have the theologian on the team? That doesn't mean that I was going to try to steamroll over them or anything. But no, they didn't think they needed a theologian.
Wow.
And that spoke loudly to me about a trend, because I don't think it was an isolated thing. I think a lot of churches just don't really care what theologians think or say.
Wow. Yeah, that is quite a commentary. Yeah. I don't, that really buttresses what you say in the article. I don't remember that in the article. That wasn't in the article, was it?
No, I didn't tell that in the article.
Oh, yeah, that is a sad commentary. So many times, it just to kind of corroborate what you're saying, so many times it does seem, and to be fair, this is somewhat anecdotal to my personal experience and observing other academic theologians who are churchmen also, or serving in churches in some capacity. I have found that in many cases, there has kind of been some sort of geographical control, as well as some excluding of theologians when it comes to, well, obvious theological matters. It's almost as if you're discounted, or because you have academic training, that's almost like a mark against you rather than an aid. And it's almost like in certain job situations, sometimes you get to a point where you're too educated, or you're perceived as too educated for particular positions, so you're overlooked because you're overeducated or overqualified. Maybe, I don't know if it's maybe something like that, but it does seem to be a common occurrence in many evangelical churches. Certainly this seems to be a kind of anti-intellectual kind of trend that has shaped it.
Of course, that's a cultural trend. It's not just religious. So maybe the religious anti-theological sentiment is coming from a kind of cultural anti-intellectualism. I think that's part of it. There are many reasons for it. But when you said overeducated, it reminded me that when I was leaving to study with Pannenberg in Germany, my uncle, who was a dear, dear Christian man, took me aside and said, "Now, Roger, don't forget, there's such a thing as an overeducated idiot." Well, it was a little too late. I was already on my way to study with Pannenberg in Germany. And I found it amusing. I thanked him for his caution, but, it just reminded me of how in the grassroots there is this anti-intellectualism.
Yeah, right. Yeah, very good. Yeah. Well, I just want to move through this article a little bit more and unpack it some. You describe theology as perceived by some as being academic, which really is kind of a pejorative term, right?
Useless.
It's useless.
Yeah.
It's even irrelevant, or it's.
Have you ever noticed that when on the media, on TV especially, and they're going to interview a scholar, they never call him or her a scholar. They call him or her an expert. Mm-hmm. Scholar will immediately turn people off.
Yeah. And so this goes beyond even just theological training.
Oh, yeah. Definitely.
There's scholarship is kind of deemed useless. Speculative, yeah. Mm-hmm. Is theology being replaced in any way by other disciplines, sociology, journalism, or something else? Well,
not so much journalism, but yes, the sociology. There is a definite trend in academic theology to have to introduce it with ethics. Mm-hmm. And make it ethical. In other words, what has been called in the past the moralization of dogma. That's an old term for the same thing, going back to the early 20th century. But more and more, if you're going to write a book of theology, you really ought to make it ethical. That is, you ought to angle it toward ethics. You ought to show how the doctrine of the Trinity feeds into ethics and is practical ethically and so forth. Which is not a bad thing in and of itself, but in the past, ethics built on theology. And now there's more of a sentiment that theology has to trail along behind ethics.
Interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting shift. Yeah. So who's to blame in American culture for this kind of demise or this kind of dwindling of kind of rich academic theology? Who's to blame in our culture?
Well, there are several people, I would say, and without naming names, although I already named Altizer and Hamilton, they're both deceased now. I did go to hear Altizer speak at a professional society meeting. I had to hear him before he died. Very southern gentleman, flowing white hair, one of those neckties that's kind of like what is a string necktie with a pearl thing at the top. Uh-huh. Very old-fashioned. And he got up in the podium, and there were at least 500 people in the room. And he started out this way. He said, Jesus was an atheist, and we must all become atheists with Jesus.
Wow. Wow.
He had the whole group
Wow.
eating out of his hand from then on. But I was sitting there thinking, this might play to some people as interesting,
Yeah.
but it's going to diminish the impact of theology, because many people are going to turn away from theology and just say, oh, come on. If academic theologians can get away with saying God is dead, then theology is nothing. It's of no practical value or interest. And that's what happened.
Yeah.
These theologians got away with it because there's no magisterium over all theologians to say, give us your credentials. You can't be a theologian anymore. And when I would go to these professional society meetings, small or large, and I was in both, there's just fragmentation. There's no unity. I was at a professional society meeting of theologians in Chicago, and a woman president of a well-known theological seminary in Chicago read a paper to us, and the title was God and Her Survival in a Nuclear Age.
Wow. Wow.
Now, this is the president of a mainline Protestant seminary, and afterwards someone asked her, could you explain what you mean by God? And she said, I don't know anything about God. Like, you idiot. Why would I know anything about God?
Yeah.
And I don't think those are completely isolated things. I could tell many stories like that. And that trickles down to the pulpits and the pews, and people hear about those things, and they go, oh, well, then, who cares about theology?
Right. Right. If the theologians don't even care and they have no unity of voice, why should we care?
And then I would say that the squabbles among evangelical theologians, and that's where I've been hit the hardest personally, has been disreputable and terrible. Theologians attacking other theologians before really listening and understanding what they're saying. And I lived through a controversy called the open theism controversy that I was very much in the middle of, not because I'm an open theist, but because I have friends who are open theists. And the attacks on them by fellow evangelicals was terrible, vicious, mean-spirited. And I think, again, a lot of people heard about that sort of thing and just said, I don't think that can be worth it to tear people, to destroy people's careers over something like that in that way.
Right.
And they did.
Right. Yeah. I've much younger, and I haven't been around as long in the theological world as you have, but I've been around the evangelical circles and particularly in Southern Baptist circles, and there is a tremendous amount of tribal control that seems to dominate over what seem to me like far more important issues in the world today, socially, politically, as well as in terms of how we order our doctrine, how we understand Scripture and the like. But these tribal discussions seem to dominate in such a way that people really get canceled as a result of being on the wrong side of the tribe. Certainly that's happened in Calvinistic and Arminian discussions. The open theism, I remember that. That was a big discussion that caused quite a lot of rifts in the Evangelical Theological Society years ago. And of course, there have been many others. It seems to be kind of endemic to the kind of the DNA of evangelical theology, at least today, that people are always fighting, but it's about, sometimes it seems to me about very tertiary issues in many cases.
Well, that's exactly what I think. And I think it's done more harm than good. And if you're on the inside, which I was, of a lot of those controversies, knowing all the parties that were fighting with each other and knowing kind of the whys, a lot of it had to do with who was going to control evangelical theology, who was going to be in charge, who was going to be at the top of the pyramid. And if you could get somebody disenfranchised and expelled from evangelical circles, that was a mark in your favor, because then you were someone who really cared about truth. So anyway, yeah, we could pursue that further, but I think that the demise of theology today has many reasons and many causes. I think I've just mentioned some of them, but I think the umbrella cause is the anti-intellectualism that is just increasing in American culture.
Yes, yeah, right. And I've seen that. I share that sentiment. So that's why when I read your article, it resonated quite a bit with me, and just in terms of church culture and in terms of the evangelical church more broadly, as well as academic theology and how it's perceived. There's been cases, I mean, I could point to several different cases where, I had a conversation with a pastor years ago, and I've had similar conversations in evangelical contexts, sometimes in more charismatic contexts, where we would be talking about an issue, and I would just want to enter into a dialogue with the pastor just to try to understand him about, regarding a sermon. And one time we were talking about the nature of marriage and divorce and the like, and some complexities there. And I mentioned some literature, and he kind of responded and said something to the effect of, I don't read academic theology so much anymore because it comes out in my preaching. And I thought, that's kind of strange. I didn't say anything. I just thought, that's strange. Why wouldn't you read the best, kind of most careful theological thinking that's out there on these issues? But
no, I do think we have to make a distinction here between really high academic theology, which is almost only published by academic presses, that is, university presses.
Yeah.
And I find some of those extremely difficult to read. I'm reading 5 books at a time, reading and listening to. And one of them right now is by a very erudite theologian named David Bentley Hart. And I can see why many people would struggle with some of what he writes. It's just very, very almost esoteric. But I benefit from it because it really challenges me. But I really wouldn't expect most pastors to read it. I'm not saying they shouldn't. I'm just saying I really don't expect it. But let's take someone like N.T. Wright.
Yeah.
Okay, he writes big books. Not all of them are easy to read. Some of them are. Surprised by Hope. Some of his books are written for pastors and lay people. And that's the kind of literature I wish they would read, is literature written by academic theologians like N.T. Wright and others, but that's really, I'm not saying watered down, but that is made accessible to pastors and lay people. But I'm finding that many don't even read any of that, anything other than, and I could name some evangelists and popular writers that I see them reading. I attended a Bible study on Wednesday nights for a few years. I've always tried to do that, but this is most recent. And I went there for about a year every Wednesday night. It was mostly lay people. And though they respected me, they didn't necessarily care what I thought about anything. And the books they were choosing for us to read were just full of theological, let's say just bad theology. Okay, one whole book was on the rapture, which I don't believe in. And I tried to introduce some reasons why I don't think the rapture is a good thing to believe in. But, it's not a heresy or anything like that. But I tried to give them reasons and suggest that maybe we read another book about eschatology, that is the end times, that is, a different perspective, but still evangelical. They weren't interested in doing that. So, I think that there are books a lot of ordinary Christians read, but they're not very good, in my opinion.
Right. Yeah.
Now, this is going to go back before your time, but when I was a kid growing up, my dad was a pastor, and we used to go to book and Bible stores. That's what they were all called. Book and Bible store. So every denomination had a book and Bible store in any major city. And we would go to book and Bible stores. And I did that all the way up until there weren't any more. And there aren't hardly any more. Cokesbury closed down. That was the United Methodist chain of bookstores. And I noticed over the years that the theology sections in those bookstores shrunk and shrunk and shrunk down to almost nothing. And the heading theology on the shelf went away completely and was replaced by various terms that really didn't have anything to do with theology. Mm-hmm. So that's another example of what we're talking about that I've noticed and that led to my writing that article on my blog.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. You did mention this, and I think this is related to one of the points you made in your article about academic theology. There's really high-level academic theology that you referred to. Mm-hmm. And in those cases, it seems like to some extent, theologians are really kind of just speaking to themselves. And I think you were suggestive of the fact that could, if that's what we perceive as being true theology, that could do some damage, further damage to theological relevance and authority in our cultural situation in terms of marginalizing theology and theologians?
Yeah.
Is that right?
Well, I think as the perception grows that is theology, when the term theology is attached to what has always been there, highly academic, scholarly theology. And I think over my lifetime, that has happened, that people have thought that's all theology is really speculative stuff that's very esoteric and written for other scholars, not for pastors or people in the pews. So that other books, like Surprised by Hope by N.T. Wright, which are theological, get thought of as not theology, but even in a bookstore might be put on a shelf under the heading practical living or something like that.
Right.
So the term itself, theology itself, has changed in people's minds.
Yeah, that's a good point. Surprised by Hope, I reread that just a few months ago, and I was really encouraged. I mean, this is the kind of like good academic theology, or at least informed by good academic theology, that's written in a very, not only accessible way, but in a pretty rich way. I mean, there's a lot of subtlety and nuance in what he's saying in the book that is very useful. It'd be great to see more of that kind of theological work. You mentioned some examples about professional societies where theology has lost its voice. I think you've already kind of touched on that a bit more, unless you had something else to say about that. You mentioned one lady in particular, I think you already mentioned this, in Chicago, who talked about theology, but then at the end of it, she said she knew nothing about God, right?
Yeah.
She spent this whole talk talking about something, or talking about God, but not actually talking about God.
It was clear to me that when she said God and her survival, by God, she meant nature, the world. She said her thesis was that we used to think that God is our Savior, but now we need to shift to thinking of ourselves as God's saviors. Wow. How? Through deep ecology and disarmament.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. Well, that seems to undermine theology's role.
And she wasn't the only one. I heard other papers at that theological professional society that were just off the wall.
Yeah. What do you think about American populism? Has that had some role in shaping church culture and shaping how we perceive theology?
Well, yes, I think definitely so. Nathan Hatch wrote a book some years ago on the democratization of Christianity in America. I don't remember if that was the exact title, but something like that. And he was about populism and the idea of, that's just deeply ingrained in American culture generally, that the elites are bad and that they are leading us astray. Whoever the elites are, they're the other. They're who we don't want to put in charge. And that was the attitude of that church in Waco that I belonged to, even though there were people in the church were, highly academic people, but about theology, no, they wanted theology to be popular. They wanted theology to be everyone is a theologian. Everyone has kind of equal say. At least that's the impression that I got from them. But yes, American culture in general is populist, anti-elitist, emphasizing everyone is equal in everything, including knowledge or ability to gain knowledge on their own. You don't need a PhD. Here's how someone defined a PhD to me. They said a PhD is when someone knows more and more about less and less until finally they know everything about nothing.
Wow. Yeah.
So that's kind of comes out of a populist mentality against PhDs. And people now can't distinguish between a PhD and a DMin or an honorary doctorate.
Yeah.
And, that's populism in terms of scholarly life. And the example I gave earlier, I noticed that in the news, when they interview someone, they never call them a scholar.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Expert works, but not scholar. People have changed the channel rather than watch a scholar.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think that's a good point. Yeah, there is no difference between a DMin or a PhD. It's just perceived as being, well, you're a doctor, you're a doctor. It's a title that you get, right? But that's
as someone who has taught many DMin seminars.
Yeah.
Let me tell you, there's a difference.
There's a difference. There's There's a huge difference. I think I was thinking about in our American situation, you mentioned this is happening in Britain as well. I mean, to some extent, the global scale as Americans, Western Christians, Western culture in general, we've had kind of an influence on the rest of the world, the global situation, certainly in terms of media, in terms of film and TV, and now the internet. Certainly, we've shaped culture in other countries as well, in terms of their values and the like. Do you think that the situation in America is similar then, similar to theology or academic theology in Europe, or would you say that there are some differences?
I won't say it's unique to America, but it is different. I think in Europe, where I lived and studied theology, there is a different mentality about scholarship and even about theology. Very few people in Germany go to church, but when I turned on German television for the very first time, the first thing I saw was a German theologian named Jürgen Moltmann speaking to a convention of disabled people about God and disability. And it was an hour long. It wasn't just a segment. It was an hour long on German television of Jürgen Moltmann, a highly academic theologian, speaking. No commercials, just unbroken. And that really impressed me about a difference. And I saw how theologians in Europe are often considered kind of cultural heroes in some sense, in a way they never would be here in the U.S. So you had Hans Kung, a Catholic theologian in Tübingen, who thousands of students tried to get into his classes. And he wrote pretty academic books, some popular, but mostly pretty academic books. But I'll bet most of those students who tried to get into his classes didn't go to church.
Right.
It's
Nonetheless,
really it's ironic, isn't it?
Yeah. Nonetheless, theology still had some kind of authority, obviously, and some sort of strong influence over there.
Yeah, Hans Kung's books were bestsellers.
Yeah, I'm reminded. So I did spend a little time in Germany. I studied over there for about 18 months under a Humboldt scheme, and the situation. I resonate with what you're saying. The situation seems to be different. Of course, you have theology is actually perceived as an academic discipline. For one thing, it's actually housed in secular universities over there because of I think largely because of Wolfhart Pannenberg's work and establishing theology as a science or as a scientific discipline, science construed in Germany in a broader sense than we normally think of as science. That's right. Yes, yes. Yeah. So certainly a different world. And my host, who was Benedict Paul Gurka, he has a post over there in the university, and according to the state, he's considered a representative, as it were, of the state, which is totally different than what we have in the American situation. I mean, the American situation, we don't I can't think of too many universities that house theology anymore, unless we're thinking of some of the Ivy League schools. But typically, it's relegated solely to parochial schools, seminaries, denominational schools, and the like.
I did go to Rice University, which is a secular university, for my MA and PhD after seminary. And I did study theology there, but it was kind of underground. I mean, the theology department was way above ground in the main campus building, but there were other people on campus were always trying to get the religious studies department canceled because there were theologians in it who actually taught Christian theology.
I see.
And we had to defend its existence. I think that's changed in the last so many years. I don't think it's theological as it was then, but that was an anomaly, is my point. That was very unusual. So you're right.
Yeah.
I mean, church-related universities were where you went to study theology. You didn't usually go to secular universities or state universities to study theology, unlike Germany, where theology is generally taught in the state universities. I studied theology at the University of Munich, which is a state university.
Yes, yes. Munich is a beautiful place. I got to visit there.
Amazing. So we're so glad we got to spend a year there. It was wonderful.
Yeah, that's great. So moving on a bit in your article, I want to talk about some of the other items in your article. There's quite a lot in that article. The eclipse of theology in the public square. You already alluded to this, but it has something to do with the Time magazine in 1966, the God is Dead movement. And you recounted a story that you had in an elevator, I think, with Henry Luce III.
Yeah.
Is that right?
The publisher of Time magazine.
Yeah. And can you tell us a little bit about that encounter, that experience?
I've had some amazing elevator encounters with people. Whenever I find myself alone in an elevator with a theologian, I strike up a conversation, or with a famous person. And this was at a special convocation in Houston, Texas. And I was invited by Rice University to be Hans Kung's chauffeur at that conference, which was shared among 3 universities, Rice, University of Houston, and I think it was St. Thomas. And so I drove Hans Kung around for 2.5 days, and we had some wonderful conversations. But I found myself alone on an elevator in the main hotel with Henry Luce, and that's when I brought up the Time magazine issue and asked him why there had been no theologians on the cover of Time magazine since 1966, whereas there had been before that. And he just said he didn't know that. So, I informed him of it, but I don't know if it made any difference.
It wasn't even on his radar.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Well, interesting. Yeah. So why do you think theology has, I think you've alluded to this, has disappeared in the wider public imagination?
Yeah, I think we've been talking about that. And I've given you all the reasons I can think of right now. Increasing anti-intellectualism. So it's not just theology, it's across the board. A real suspicion or disdain of scholarship that isn't directly practical or isn't going to have practical results for everyday life. and in the churches, just a lack of interest. Now, I have to make an exception when I talk about the churches. I have found that many Presbyterian churches still value theology. Not all, but many do. Across the denominations, there are several Presbyterian denominations, and they tend to be more academically inclined, or at least sympathetic to academic theology, than, say, Baptists, Pentecostals, independent churches, and so forth. So, I've had some great experiences in Presbyterian churches teaching adult Sunday school classes, adult Bible studies. Often they're very hungry for theology, and I appreciate that about them, but I find that to be rare.
Yeah. What do you think about, you mentioned this in terms of Protestantism not having a magisterium, and I think that was part of your comments about the kind of perception or perceived disunity amongst theologians and the fact that there is no magisterium. Would you say that, I think you're right, in Presbyterian circles, I've run in some Presbyterian circles, and I had a lot of friends at Covenant Seminary when I lived in St. Louis, Missouri, and there definitely was a perception that theology matters, theology has some authority in terms of the church life and in terms of how preaching is informed and should be informed. So that seems relevant to Presbyterian culture in many cases, particularly in the PCA and some of the other conservative Presbyterian circles. But what about Roman Catholics? You think they have a magisterium? Do you think theology still there's still a relevant culture there that
Yes.
deems it as important?
I'm not in touch with Catholic theology or Catholic religion in the grassroots, but I did have a Catholic priest who had a doctoral degree from a university in Rome speak to my classes at Truett Seminary. And we were friends, and we had many conversations. I took classes to his church, and he talked to us, and he was very, very much interested in theology. I had the feeling that he maybe wasn't typical of all Catholic priests. He was more academically inclined. But my impression is that there is a thriving theological group of colleagues among Catholics, both on the right and the left, the conservative and the liberal. Those aren't the terms they use, as integralist and revisionist. But yes, theology thrives in Catholic circles more than in Protestant circles, especially in low church Protestant circles. And I read a lot of Catholic theology. I enjoy it. I benefited from it. Catholic theologians like Walter Kasper, a Catholic cardinal, have been great. I've loved reading them.
Who is it, Cardinal?
Balthasar.
Balthasar.
Walter Kasper. Kasper. Yeah, German cardinal and theologian. But then I said Hans Urs von Balthasar, but he's dead now. And his books are not easy to read. Most of them aren't. He's very academically inclined, but he's having a real impact and kind of filling a gap left behind by Rahner and Kung as they've died. And so is Balthasar, but I mean, his star is on the rise in Catholic circles, whereas the others are not.
Yeah.
And that's all for the good, because he was fairly conservative.
Yes. Yeah, very good. Yeah. I'm so I was raised Pentecostal, and some of that I still carry with me, but I became Baptist, Southern Baptist, and kind of ran in Reformed Baptist circles. Theology seemed to have some relevance in many of the Reformed Baptist circles, kind of because they're trying to be Presbyterian, but not baptized babies, basically. But now I'm Anglican, and I've been swimming in Anglican waters for some time. I'm ordained in the Anglican world, conservative Anglican, or what we like to call Orthodox Anglican. And I mean, similar to the Reform world, I think theology still matters in kind of Orthodox and conservative Anglicanism. But what I've found is that academic theology doesn't there's certainly not a culture for it. There's very few schools for Orthodox Anglicans, very few in existence right now. And of course, once there's a cutoff from the mainline denomination, there's so much that's given up in terms of heritage and tradition, it seems. And Orthodox Anglicans are typically not engaged with the wider academic theological discussions of the day. So it's a bit.
Williams?
Some of them do.
Yeah, I would hope so.
Some of them do. Yeah, some of them do. Some of them are a little skeptical of him, but some of them do.
Oh, yeah.
I think Rowan Williams is important, though. I do.
Yeah,
I think he's
I agree.
important. And recently I've become kind of more attuned and enamored with Austin Farrer. Is that pronounced
Farrer,
correctly?
yes.
Farrer.
Yes,
So,
Finite and the Infinite.
yes.
His best book.
I think he's a really important theologian that's underappreciated, but nonetheless we claim him as an Anglican. So Robert McSwain really has made me aware of his works, and I mean, he claims he's up there with some of the more well-known theologians like Karl Rahner and von Balthasar, and so as an Anglican we should really retrieve from his thinking, seems to me. But
And people often mention N.T. Wright as an Anglican theologian, but technically he's not a theologian. he's a New Testament scholar. Yes,
that's
but
right.
He has
yes,
swerved into our territory in doing theology.
He has, and he I think he's, in terms of his more public-facing theology, he does a great job. I mean, I think in terms of how he communicates, I think he does a great job. Yeah. Well, so what keeps theology alive for you in light of all this sort of? Oh, you did mention, I think you alluded to some conversations you've had with family as well. That must be pretty disheartening, to talk to family members and relatives who really think very little.
I also grew
of
up
theology.
Pentecostal, and the Pentecostals I grew up with had no use for theology. Theology was mostly a bad word, although in the Bible college I went to, we did have courses in systematic theology. But in the pews and in many pulpits, you could talk about doctrine, but not theology. It was kind of a complicated picture about theology. So theology was kind of confined to colleges and the very few seminaries that existed. I don't think there was any Pentecostal seminary when I was growing up here in the United States, but there are now some. But yeah, there was a deep anti-intellectualism in the Pentecostalism I grew up in, and it was hard. And probably the main reason I left Pentecostalism was the anti-intellectualism. And I had people just get up and walk away from me when I was trying to explain why I didn't believe in the rapture or something like that. And so then I became Baptist, and that didn't really help a whole lot. There's pretty anti-intellectualism among Baptists as well, but a little more freedom and some respect for theology. But yeah, over the years, my family definitely put a distance between them and me because I was overeducated. And whether I actually was or not, there was this sense of my thinking that I was above them because I had theological education. They didn't want to know what I thought. They never asked me theological questions. They didn't want to know.
Yeah, there's kind of this attitude of, I guess you can just go to the Bible for the answers.
Right.
And I can do that just as well as you can.
Yeah.
Right. To some extent. I mean, that's been the perception that I've experienced in many contexts, as well as familial contexts. And which is unfortunate. There's no answers are very simple in some cases, simplistic, overly simplistic, and so there's no sense or urge or felt need to think about these questions or to struggle with any of these questions because they've already been resolved by, well, I guess some sort of biblical answer that is available. But
stories always come to my mind. The older I get, the more stories I have. So as I was worrying about leaving Pentecostalism, because most of my relatives that I was close to were Pentecostal. My uncle was president of our Pentecostal denomination. And I was really starting to not believe in the key Pentecostal doctrine of speaking in tongues as necessary for being fully Spirit-filled. They call it the initial evidence doctrine, as you probably remember. So I went to my uncle one-on-one, and I said, we're supposed to believe that you have to speak in tongues to be filled with the Holy Spirit. He said, well, yeah, that's what makes us Pentecostal. If we didn't believe that, we wouldn't be Pentecostal. And I said, well, what about Billy Graham? And he said, well, what about him? And I said, he just came out with a book on the Holy Spirit in which he says he's never spoken in tongues. And I said, do you think he's Spirit-filled? And he looked at me and said, well, he's the exception. And I said, I followed up with, but if I go to seminary and get a doctoral degree and come back and teach in our Bible college, can I teach that there are exceptions? And he said, no. And that was one of those aha moments where, I realized my future in Pentecostalism was not looking very good. So I went around I was in a Baptist seminary. I went to some Baptists and said, will you take me? And he said, yes. So it all worked out. And then I went to teach theology at Oral Roberts. Yeah. I went to teach theology at Oral Roberts University, and that really confused my family.
Oh, wow. Yes. Yes.
I was only there for 2 years, though.
Yeah. Yeah. Where were you before Truett? Where you were?
Bethel College and Seminary.
Bethel. That's right. I remember Bethel. Yes.
For 15 years.
That's right. 15 years. Very good.
Yeah,
very good.
I loved it. Yes. It was great. The pay was bad, but my colleagues were great.
Yeah, colleagues really can make and break a situation. Or maybe it's the administration, but...
Well, I won't say anything about that. That's a different story.
So I don't know if we got to this, if you answered this question. I was wondering about what keeps theology alive for you?
Oh, yeah. You did ask that. Well, partly that, it's inertia. I can't stop. I'm just obsessed with theology and have been most of my life, even since I was a kid. I remember I was 12 years old and sitting in Sunday school, and the Sunday school teacher was teaching nonsense. And I corrected him, and he threw the teacher's quarterly down on his desk and said, "Then you teach the class, Roger." And I guess that was my initiation into being a theologian. And I did teach the class. And I've always been interested in theological questions, and yes, in answers, of course. There are more questions than answers, I would say, but it fascinates me. God fascinates me. What are God's attributes and what do they mean, and questions like that. And, I was always interested, but then several events came along that really propelled me further into it. And one of them was, my coming up against Calvinism and Calvinists, who more than implied that if you're not a Calvinist, you're not really fully an evangelical Christian. I got the first issue of Modern Reformation magazine, and out of that came my friendship with Michael Horton, who was the editor of it then. But it had a cover story. The cover was about Arminianism and how wrong it is. And so that kind of launched me into a new phase of my theological endeavors of defending Arminianism and really going deep into why I'm an Arminian, what it means to be Arminian, what it doesn't mean to be Arminian, what Calvinism is, which is in contrast to what a lot of Calvinists think it is, and just exploring and then writing on those subjects, which got me into a lot of trouble, especially when I wrote a book called Against Calvinism. But, it's been part of my life as a theologian is to, just explore those questions and try to get others to explore them.
That's good. That's good. Yeah. That's right. Against Calvinism. That was that stirred some of the discussion. Certainly, that was
could be a whole other discussion.
That could be a whole other discussion. Absolutely, that provoked a lot of discussion. My doctoral supervisor, and this could take us down another trail, but he's Oliver Crisp, and so he's done a lot of work on kind of the history of Calvinism, and it certainly looks a bit different than what we see today in contemporary neo-Calvinism, with the young Reformed and restless and Reformed. But that's a whole other discussion, of course. But I think at least what's nice about those circles is there's at least some fire.
Oh, yeah.
There's some fire. There's some vibrancy about theology there.
There are some fires
if
that
we
they
could
want
say
to put
something
me
positive. Yes.
I have been metaphorically tied to the stake and a fire lit around me by some Calvinists.
Yes. You are the metaphorical Servetus of the day.
Yeah, I guess. I don't know about
for
that.
many of them.
Yeah, but for some of them, yes.
Okay.
There are a few who are
For
that
some of them,
bit,
yes.
Yeah.
Some of them
few.
are pretty staunch. Yes. Yeah.
Michael
yeah.
Horton and I became friends. Still consider him a friend. So Arminians and Calvinists can be friends even if we disagree.
That's good. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Horton is a nice gentleman. Yeah, he's a very nice gentleman. There are some good Calvinists out there too.
Oh, yeah. Some of them are my relatives.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, very good. Is that right?
Yeah. I have cousins who went to Calvin College in Grand Rapids, and I don't know if they ever read my book, but we were friends at one time. We've drifted apart, but I grew up with them and going to their homes and listening to conversations between my father and their parents about Calvinism versus Arminianism, and that probably was part of what got me interested in theology, is those conversations.
Yeah, well, tell me briefly then, do you have any further writings that we may have missed, or any further thoughts since you wrote this original article that's changed? Or is your thesis basically the same?
Oh, yeah.
It's basically the same. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Okay. Very good. Okay. What would you, if you could give any advice to theologians entering into the next generation, what would you say? What would you say to them?
I do that. I have seminary students who want to be theologians, and I tell them it's not a wonderful profession to be in. Don't do it unless you can't do otherwise. And that was my case. I couldn't be anything but a theologian. I felt called to be a theologian. And some of them are. I have frequent contact with one who's getting his PhD in theology at a well-known Christian college/university and enjoying it very much, but also finding it hard in the churches to relate that to the people and to make himself someone that they can embrace and accept once they learn that he is becoming a theologian. That automatically puts a certain distance between you and the people in the pews unless you can win them over, which I spent the last 4 years doing at my Mennonite church. And I think it's worked. I don't think anybody is wary of me, but that's because I have worked hard to be one of them and to preach when I get to preach practical sermons that are also theologically informed. And so it's been a joy, but it's hard work once they know you're a theologian to win them over.
Yeah. Very good. Very good. Well, Dr. Olson, I really appreciate your time. Thank you. And thank you again for your article. It certainly, like I said before, it stimulated some thought in me and some further reflection. And that's obviously what's motivated some of my more public reflections. And so this podcast is largely, in many respects, motivated by you and your article. And we're going to explore further some of these issues in the future regarding theology, public theology, the state of evangelical seminaries, and what we can do to kind of change or make changes in the future in terms of the evangelical culture in which we're a part of and we're responsible for. And so I appreciate your time. Thank you very much. And I appreciate your time. Thanks again. What if the world's deepest questions are still theological? All of them. And we've just forgotten how to ask them. What if the loneliness that Roger Olson speaks of is actually a sign that theology really does matter more than ever? Because it's the one voice we haven't tried to listen to. It's the voice of God through the voice of reason and in using theologians as the mouthpiece of that God has spoken. On this show, we're going to listen again because even in an age of confusion, it's still a theological world after all. If today's conversation stirred something in you, subscribe, rate, share this with someone asking big questions about God, meaning, and why theology still matters. You're not alone, and neither is theology.